This is a continued discussion from the previous episode of Nose to Tail, a podcast where we explore the world of aviation lifecycle solutions, insights, and more. Presented by Jet Midwest.
I worked with your team at Ryan when you guys were doing the Con Air. We had replacement seats that we had sold your team that they would put into the belly so that when they got destroyed on a three-leg flight, they'd at least have a spare set to pull out of the belly to reinstall, so that it was always one ready to go. Of course, those were MD-80 seats. I wasn't making a whole lot of money on that transaction, I don't think. Just a couple bucks. I buy a cup of coffee, I think. Maybe talk to us a little bit about Con Air, so to speak.
Con Air, Jim Flynn. Jim Flynn's one of those guys in aviation that he was there. Jim worked for a lettered agency allegedly, in certain times in history in the Latin American countries doing some things. I think that's all I can say without getting in trouble. I don't know anymore if everybody asks. His call sign, I think, was -8. And Jim knocked on the door in Rockford one day and said, "Hey, I got this MD-80 program." We didn't really have it. Like in aviation, nobody really has what they say they have. Nobody has the airplanes that they say they have, and you don't find that out till later. We were gullible at first, but learned pretty quickly. But Jim won the contract with the U.S. Marshals Service to fly MD-80s they were based out of Louisiana in the South, and they flew for a bunch of people, a bunch of government agencies, but the win was for the Marshals Service. And you were flying people around the country. You're flying prisoners to their destinations. You were helping to break up gangs at certain prisons to move people different places. The flight attendants on those were 280-pound guys with handcuffs called Gus and Bruce. And, I'm a lawyer by training. And so when I learned that we had shackle bars in each row that people were handcuffed to, I said, well, what happens if something happens to the aircraft? They said, don't ask that question. So that's as far as I'll go with that one. But that fleet, based on where it was and its utilization, we were able, when Katrina hit, they were all placed in that region. That was home base. So we had the mechanics, the hardware, and the lift. And so we turned to some of the programs that the government put out then to move people. So we moved people out across the country that had to get out of the region. And we moved some food, medical supplies, other stuff back in, and I'll say a number of heavily armed SWAT teams and others that flew back into the region, that no plane went back down there deadheaded. We still had the small plane operation at the time, and the guys that were running that, there was a guy by the name of Pete DeLeese, that he had a relationship with somebody that was a doctor, a researcher at Tulane Medical, and he had 20 years of cancer research that was on dry ice. And he had X number of days before that dry ice was gone and his research was gone. And so they discussed whether or not we'd want to get a crew together and go down and help them get that out. It wasn't just us, it was some agencies involved. I desperately wanted to go on that flight. That's one flight I wanted to go on, and I could have gone on. My wife talked to me, we had a discussion, and I thought, oh, babe, okay, I'll stay home. And probably best somebody was more equipped to go wet. And as they went down and as they got in closer to Tulane, that crew was shot at. They did get the stuff out, but the first floor of the hospital had water in it, people in it. People came there to get medicine and other things that were in the place. And so a lot of places were ransacked. There were things you didn't want to see, maybe as a civilian, that I might think about at night more. So
that hard conversation that your wife had with you was impactful for you.
We had a difficult conversation at the moment it died, and I listened to my wife, who I should do that more often.
I try to do it as often as I can, keeps me out of trouble. So that is a little bit of crisis management there in several ways. What dovetailed sort of I don't want to say the end of Ryan, but maybe what were some of the things they struggled with because I know some of that related to the financial crisis in 08, 09. Maybe talk to us a little bit about how that came about and some of the struggles.
Yeah. You look at cycles. If you own a couple of different kinds of businesses, you hope they're counter-cyclical. And for a while, real estate and aviation were counter-cyclical. We used the aviation money in some harder times in real estate, and then vice versa, just the profits off of that. And in 2008, the profits dropped for both. 2007, 2008, real estate just dried up. I can remember when I thought in 2007 there were too many Walmarts and Targets going in, and we were about to put another Target in the middle of two Targets in a Midwestern city. But I thought, wow, aren't you going to eat your own audience? That thought occurred to them at the same time, and they put a national mandate. They stopped construction. They realized they were eating their own markets and wanted to look at it. And everybody stopped about that same time. And then the financial crisis hit. So you had slowdown, then you had a no down, and the banks that loved real estate in the upswing hated real estate in the downswing. And if they hated real estate, aviation, what? How many lenders really understand aviation?
None.
You know, you've got the big international people that will do a lot based on your asset base and ratios. So you're ratio driven heavily from your financial statement. And nobody wanted aviation. So it was tough. We had a bank out of Wichita, a wonderful interest bank. They were very good. They were accommodating. And even to the end, they were a great partner in the resolution of Ryan. But so the bottom dropped out on both. And the military flying dried up. That was there for a while. It was still episodically there. But when that was gone, there was no place to turn those aircraft. So we had to find markets other places. I guess we still had some craft flying, but the craft at that time, they a couple times thought they were going to redo how they did that program. We helped talk them out of that. Again, we were on the UPS team, and UPS was looking for somebody with bigger aircraft. The military basically it was like buying a used car. They always got the used car to fly their people. They wanted to have more seats, so they were flying less trips. And so they wanted 380s, they wanted 777s. And so in 2010 and 11, Mark and Jim went on the search. So Mark and Jim's great adventure across the world. As I told the story, looking backward in 2012, people thought that we were involved with one of those three-letter agencies because every country that we went to blew up when we were there. We were in Greece when the riots were occurring. We were in Lisbon when the riots were occurring. We were in London when South London was in flames and all that stuff was going on in the streets. And we were in Cairo the week after Tunisia fell. There was a board meeting of Egypt Air that we were in the building, and somebody set himself on fire and died in front of the building, protests outside. It was a very wild time. In January of 2011, we had contracted, Jim and I had gone there. I thought we were going for about 5 days. Jim left after 5, and I was there by myself for another 10. And negotiating with Egypt Air, GE had agreed to finance and bring in 3 new 777s for them. So they had some 777s they were going to park and had to get rid of. So we were negotiating for one of those. It would have been a great plane for the DoD program. I learned a lot about negotiation, international negotiation there. I was pretty naive. I learned that we got to Egypt Air and we were supposed to start at 10 in the morning the first day. We started at about 1 o'clock. The next day we were supposed to start at noon. We started about 3 o'clock. And it went the next day. We started at 6 and went till about 2 in the morning. So you wait, you worry down, part of the strategy. And then when Jim left, I was negotiating with a team of 20. Literally, there were 20 people in the room. And at any given time, 1, 2, or 3 of them were gone. And so you negotiate a paragraph or two. Somebody would come back and say, no, I can't work. You can't do that. And so you had this fight. And about maybe after a few days of that, I had finally my epiphany. I was slow on the uptake, but somebody came back in the room and said no. And I looked at them. I threw my glasses across the room. I stood up, said a few words that I normally wouldn't say in a negotiation, and said, look, we're going to sign this contract as it is, or I'm going to leave. And 20 minutes later, we signed the contract. So it just took me too long.
They definitely wore you down. They don't think they got the result maybe that they were looking for still, but.
So we sign it, we go home, and again, you heard me the last couple of days, you don't celebrate till the money's in the bank.
That's right.
You have some mini celebrations maybe, but it's not a done deal until it's a done deal. When that aircraft is paid for, you got the paper on it, and it's at your hangar. A lot of risks between there. So go back home, and what happened, like right as I left, we were in Heliopolis, which is where the Mubarak family was. We were next to an Air Force base, so I felt pretty safe. I had some friends who taught at the school there, the American school, and they were waiting for us when we were way late when we came in. And I had told Jim the three-letter agency guy that this trip is going to be different for us because people are going to know we're here as a defense contractor. So market-oriented. So we're late. We're very late. We're driving to the hotel finally, and on a 6-lane, 8-lane highway going 60 miles an hour, and we stopped dead because there was a mule cart in the middle of the road in front of us. But there were armed guards. There was a stadium to the right. I'll never forget the image of it. There was a soccer game, an Ashland soccer game going on, and the military was everywhere, keeping that place safe. We get to the hotel, and my friends are still there. They said, "Oh, it's okay. The people at the desk knew exactly where you were. There were people from the military telling them what you were doing." Jim looked at me. There's other stories I could tell about that side of this, but I'm not going to talk about those here.
All right.
So we signed that contract, and we left. The Mubarak regime the next week, over the course of the next few weeks, he fired his cabinet, and then their bank accounts were frozen, and other stuff happened. Ultimately, he was arrested. And through that summer in Egypt, a lot of the business units, the companies are led by former military officers. At that time, they were, at least. And there was an Air Force officer that headed Egypt Air. What we came to understand is that nobody was willing to put their signature on that contract to get that airplane out the door with what was going on there. So that airplane burned up for an insurance loss that summer, and in July, I think, on the tarmac. That didn't help us solve our DOD problem. And we had been going back and forth in Lisbon, some other places to find a 777. And we ended up at Virgin in London, and they had one, maybe two aircraft that were sitting on a tarmac in Toulouse. They had 16 hours on the engine. We ended up signing a lease for that 330, not a 777, but an A330, and brought it back. And the military was phenomenally pleased. They'd never had a new aircraft like that. They never had that many seats across that many aisles. And it was nice to get that into service. But there was a pullback, a little change in the craft program, and we lost that flying. And then we were on the road again and ended up in Turkey, and we established that reciprocal relationship there. And some of our pilots didn't know how to act out of country. For some reason, guys jumping out of windows at hotels and get that call in the middle of the night. It's a different kind of an AOG. You got a person AOG on the ground. And so a lot of interesting things went on. Aviation is exciting, right, Patrick?
Absolutely. You never know what's going to come. When I did the work from the MD-80s, that was really my first time that I interfaced with Ryan. We're supplying a lot of parts from the American aircraft that we had dismantled. And the operations team wanted to keep some very specific cockpit instrumentation in the flyway kit. And it was items that didn't make a lot of sense to us. We didn't quite understand it. It's the story we were told, so I don't know how accurate it is, but I would guess there's enough truth probably in it. But some of the countries may be landing in Cartagena, and the pilots want a couple extra days in Cartagena, and they would simply say, "Wow, this display is not bright enough for me. You have to replace it." And they'd be stuck there for another day or two on the beach or somewhere fancy that they wanted to be. And so the operational guys were like, "No, just buy everything. Just get anything that they could squawk. Get one in the belly of every airplane." So those guys have to reinstall it and come back that day. So we heard some good stories from those guys. And it was the same thing on the seats. When you're flying prisoners around, they're not always as cordial a passenger. It's probably why you had the more robust flight attendants.
Indeed.
And so there was, times where the seat needed to be replaced, bodily fluids or whatever might happen to be present there. And you can't have the next passenger sitting in that. So that's why those were in the belly of the aircraft.
Well, funny you should mention that, Patrick. That was a oft-felt scenario. If I'm going to sit here, I'm going to sit here.
Yeah, exactly.
They left some presents.
Yeah. So, but again, in typical aviation fashion, you didn't stop flying the flights. You simply found a way to say, well, okay, we can manage how to work around that and not be stuck somewhere with seats we can't fill. We'll find a different way to resolve that issue. To all of you, be sure and like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Nose to Tail. Please like and subscribe to our channel. Presented by Jet Midwest.